Amrita Tripathi, who's a very well-known Delhi-based novelist and a senior journalist who's currently on a break from mainstream journalism. She's a former news anchor with CNN IBN, and she started her career in the news as a trainee sub-editor at the Indian Express. She's a prolific Twitterati personality and a speed talker. Amrita is an avid reader and delights in all forms of storytelling. Uh, Whilst we are on the topic of the session today, which is on writing and the darker side of Delhi, we'll also be talking about Amrita's second novel called The Sibious Knot. Amrita, welcome to LitFestX.
Thank you so much. Thanks for this.
Yeah. So, being a Delhi-based novelist, having lived in Delhi for so many years, clearly you have seen, as you said, the darker side of Delhi, and you've also been a journalist for many years, and you've obviously seen Delhi from a different angle as a journalist, also as a resident, also as a independent girl out there. And how has that impacted your writing?
That's a really good question, Kumar. Actually, the thing is that, I should start by saying that I love Delhi. I think it's a difficult city to learn to love, but it really, once it has a hold on you, and you're sitting in Bombay, so I don't expect you to agree, but once it has a hold on you, it's really hard to let go. And I really should say, I think in the last 5 to 10 years, I think that there's been a lot of change for the positive. Whether it's the Delhi metro, whether it's spaces opening up, I definitely see changes for the positive. But it's exactly what you said. As a journalist, you can't live in the city and watch the news or read the news and sort of be part of the news without being aware of all of the sort of terrible things that also happen in this city. And I feel like we've only recently started talking about some of the brutal violence, some of the more, the sort of seedier side of urban life, the darker reality that you're talking about. It's not something we used to reference early in our writing, so much in our reporting. They used to be seen as one-off cases, But I think that's really where all of these experiences came together for this book, for The Sibious Knot, because sometimes these are the stories that also need to be told, unless you bring these stories out of the dark, you're not going to be able to address some of the underlying issues.
Very interestingly, so what you're saying is that whether we like it or not, some of this narrative about Delhi being unsafe for women, and clearly the kind of hate crimes and crimes against women we've seen in the recent years, has found its way into popular discourse, popular writing. It's a given almost that if you're writing about Delhi, and if there is an element talking about women or safety or crime, then it's going to be difficult to write a positive shade on Delhi, on those sort of markers.
No, absolutely, you're right. And I think in the last few years, definitely since 2012, which really seemed to be that watershed moment when everyone started talking about the issues that are confronting women in this city, and the same women who've had to deal with this sort of in a more toned down version of harassment. There's not a woman in Delhi, I think, who will not have a story to share. But at the same time, what I find interesting is that we need to have that sort of discourse spread across, because we have this whole, the bogeyman is always a stranger, the bogeyman is always that the other, the violence you're talking about, and from some of the stories I was doing, for example, at CNN IBN, and many of them were tracking mental health issues. We also did a couple of half an hours on abuse, and this also informs my writing, because what people who are working with survivors will tell you of child abuse, that it's usually somebody known to the family, known to the child. It's a person in a position of trust. So it's somehow like our narratives don't really keep up with that, and it's sort of what we tell ourselves is one thing, and what the reality is another. Now, obviously, when you're writing a novel, you're not setting out to sort of preach or lecture people, but these are some of the strands of that darker side that I think have informed the story in a big way, but also are important to talk about, because there's no other way to talk to your children or keep them safe if you're not able to have these conversations increasingly at younger and younger ages.
Yeah, when you are saying sort of conversations, especially with children, or I would say even with the senior citizens, if you will. are you seeing a lot of these discourses becoming far more open, far more sort of out there? Because the children and these senior citizens are also reading about it in the papers themselves, watching it on television. So, do you
Hmm.
think that, as a writer, as a journalist, these conversations are not so much about breaking the ice or having a conversation? It's more about saying, well, how can I answer your questions about these issues?
Sure, absolutely. Because I think as a journalist, even maybe more so than as a writer, you feel that part of your responsibility is raising awareness, right? It's not just saying that, oh my God, look at these terrible things that are happening, which unfortunately sometimes becomes a very sensationalized version of the reality. It's about how do you address them. You need to give the platform to people who've been working on these issues. How do you have those conversations without terrorizing the whole public? I mean, what this book is very dark. I always start with that warning. And sometimes I just want to say that, there's a counterpoint to this story as well. I mean, sometimes what you're looking for is what you end up finding. So, I mean, the kids in this book are sort of very confused, make some bad choices. There's some addiction issues there as well. But they're obsessed with this idea of the darkness. And as a result, everything they look for is through that filter. Obviously as a journalist, that's not what you're doing. As a journalist, you're looking to raise awareness. And as you say, having those conversations across the age spectrum, I would say. I have noticed, I mean, we were talking about mental health just a few minutes ago. What psychologists and psychiatrists tell us, for example, 1 in 4 people at some point will face some sort of mental health issue, whether it's depression or something in their lives. I think in earlier generation didn't have that luxury of talking about these things. Most families would have like a relative or somebody who's not well. We don't really get into the details. It's not a question at that time whether it was the luxury or liberty of getting treatment. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but we used to have that sort of stigma and silence, kind of also because of this kind of adopted shame. Now I think people talk more openly, at least. And again, Kumar, I must say, we're talking about the very privileged urban middle class, people who have access to services and have a disposable income. But you find people talking about going to therapy. You find people saying that it's okay to have to acknowledge that you have issues rather than just hiding those away.
So are you then taking some of these trends, and so when you're writing, I'm assuming you're obviously then aware to say that who's the reader, and how much, how dark can you make it for the average reader? What are the trends? I mean, how are you reading into all of this?
So I think that again, because it's a novel, you do a lot of the research, and also, like I was saying, as a journalist, some of these stories. So I kind of like fed off of that a little bit and followed up with some of my sources and contacts to get a picture of the what's actually happening. Some of those facts are actually more disturbing than anything I could make up. So that kind of forms the basis and informs the writing. I remember we were doing a story on sex education and different state governments saying they want to stop sex education in schools because it's such a controversial subject, which it's really not. Because when you look at what psychiatrists are telling, there's a child in adolescent psychiatrist in Delhi telling us that kids are coming in at 12 and 13 worried that they're pregnant. At the same time, the school is not giving them information. Parents don't want to talk about it. So so this is sort of the basis. It gives you a very good insight as a journalist into what's happening, and as you mentioned, trends, and also societally what's happening. I would say that forms the kind of framework of my story, and then slowly these characters kind of come up and sort of come to life in their own way. And as I'm navigating those issues with them, again, it's not so much as sitting and giving a lecture or trying to give a sort of prescriptive, here's how we fix things. It's more about following them through their journey, through some very bad choices and decisions that they make. And it should be probably a reflection, a more realistic reflection than you would think. And as to the question of the reader, that's actually a very good question. I think when you're starting out to write, there's 2 ways of going about it. I mean, one, you can also be paralyzed by worrying that no one's going to read your book, and that for me is a very difficult conversation to have with myself. So I kind of put that aside, just write a story that I think is a good story. Slowly you get champions along the way. Luckily, I have an agent, a publisher. Some people will come back and give you feedback. And now, of course, with Twitter, you always get to have quite quickly that instant feedback, whether it's good or bad, but it's a good check, because I've seen, I mean, from a younger, like, 13, 15-year-olds to older people telling me that it's a difficult book, but it's a good, it's an important read. So that's helpful.
I can see the book in the background. Why don't you sort of show it to our viewers?
Yeah. Thank you. I was hoping you could see that. So this is the Sibius knot. Is that like, yes, visible? The cover actually is a very dark but compelling cover, I feel. It just won an award for the cover design at Aarti Deveshai won this award at Publishing Next. So I quite love it because it kind of gives you, this is one of those books where you're like, please judge it by the cover. You know, this is exactly what
Absolutely.
the book is about. Yeah, so
Absolutely. No, it's a very interesting cover. And, so tell us more about the title as well. What is the Sibius knot? What are you trying to convey?
So the Sibius knot, actually, and that's a very good question. It's something that the characters invent. So I'm actually quite pleased because now people have come up and told me that we've Googled it, we couldn't find it, and I'm like, that's great because it's actually literally invented by this group of characters. It's very central to that quest I was talking about. So they feel that essentially they're in a fight against the darkness. You can read it at that one very literal level, of course. And you're sort of tracking this group of 5 friends from when they're 14, 15 till their late 20s or early 30s, and slowly this sort of close group of friends is unraveling. I mean, a couple of people have died, you find out early on, and they're sort of coming to terms with that environment, their own internal demons. It's on a trip when they first think or see that they see the Sibius knot, and they feel like it sort of encapsulates them in this fight against the devil. I'm not sure how many people have seen that Mobius strip, which is a sort of mathematical diagram. It's kind of like a representation of infinity. So in their heads, they've twisted this and made it a knot, and basically has them all entangled in it. So it's something they invent, but it's also, I thought, very reflective of their circumstances. So I thought that it'll work for a title.
Very, very interesting title, I must say. And when you're referring to this entire urban backdrop in the book, have you then seen what readers' reactions have been with regards to the backdrop, with regards to them being able to identify, with this entire backdrop of urban reality and sort of crime, etc.
Yeah. So it's because Delhi is sort of the unnamed character in this book. Though these kids are also like, the 90s generation is a very important plot point. They're also very cosmopolitan. But I have had from some readers and some friends who started it at least, talking about the Delhi that's described in the beginning, which is, all Connaught Place and Nirulas and ice cream. So there's also like moments in time that, for a generation are shared markers. And actually, possibly even more than that, I was at that Masuri festival I was telling you about, and some of the kids were talking about how they related to the bits that are talking about Dehradun and Delhi. So it's nice to get that kind of connection because it also forms, again, like part of the bedrock of the book. There's a lot of sort of pop culture references for my generation. So I've had some comments on that as well, which is nice, whether it's Nirvana, Kurt Cobain, that kind of moment in the 90s where, the grunge came of age and alternative music was one, So this is not, again, something that you'd read as a theme, but it weaves through the book. So that's nice when people pick up on those things, and feel like, I think it's, as a reader, when I find those moments in books I'm reading, it draws me in further to the story. So that's nice to hear too.
Right. And, like you mentioned a little earlier on in the conversation, that now you're seeing people a little more open to sort of going in for counseling and accepting that there are issues. Clearly your book is dealing a lot with individuals' own sort of personal issues, which, and at the core of mental health. And, where do you see all of this, especially, in urban India today, in larger cities and metros, clearly children, adolescents, I mean, even adults, but, it's the adolescent years where, kids are more fragile, in terms of peer pressure, in terms of, deciphering between right and wrong, morality, what their parents expect them to do, what their friends expect them to do, what do they want to do. And how are you treating that in the book?
So actually, a lot of that, I mean, that is quite central because you're right. That's the age when I think everything is so fragile. I think one of the main points of this book, if at all, is that relationships are fragile. People are more fragile than we think. You never actually know what someone is struggling with or going through, and because these characters are dealing so much with death and are not really able to make their peace with the fact, they're not giving themselves time to grieve or to mourn. I feel like that's something that's also reflective. Like, I mean, often we don't, our sort of this century is all about, get up and go and move on and, like, just show that you're actually tough as nails. which I think that trickles down, I mean, and you're absolutely right. Adolescents face so many pressures from all of these. I mean, we've all grown through this. It's not an easy time for anyone, I think, but on top of that, when you feel that you're marginalized, that people don't understand you, you're much more likely to succumb to sort of the stronger personalities in your group. And, when I was talking to these high school kids, I was like, everyone has seen those, or grown up with those kind of groups. So there's always like one person who's a leader, and peer pressure and popularity. And as you grow older, obviously sometimes you outgrow that. In this case, what I was researching and what I thought would be interesting to do is to see what if you're in a cult and you don't quite realize it. So this group of friends is so close. They're not very close to their families. They don't feel that anyone else understands them. So they're much more susceptible to what this one boy is telling them, that they're in a fight against the devil, our souls are up for grabs. And like when you start thinking like that, actually, and you start, like I was saying, looking for something, usually you'll find it. So if you go out from the next, as an experiment for the next month or so, trying to track all of the horrible things that are happening, I'm pretty sure you'll find a huge map of evil and darkness, which is not what you do as a rational, sane human being. I just wanted to say also, I mean, I think what we're seeing in the US, which has not really come here yet, though, is that you're at that stage where you're almost over medicating your kids, though. Like almost everyone has a prescription for ADD and medication, and even when at a very young age. So here it's not come yet, and I hope it doesn't happen. But 5-6-year-olds who in another generation will be calling hyper or just restless are now actually diagnosed, and given something. And so that also troubles me a little bit, and I think that reflects in the book this idea that everyone should be this one norm. That's never been the case, and it's never going to be the case.
Right. Your book clearly has several layers. So you're dealing with crime, you're dealing with mental health issues, you're dealing with sort of personality issues, and there's this whole dark sort of undercurrent. What do you think is the flavor or the aftertaste that the average reader is going to be left with?
That's a tricky one. Keeping in mind, I want to sell more books. I feel that it's a little unsettling. I was told by a friend and an ex-colleague who sort of went on Twitter to say it's very I would say it's a difficult to read book, but it's definitely a tougher book because as we're talking about the darker realities. But even as we're saying that some of these themes are there, and you're talking about how fragile people are and how fragile relationships are, the underlying lesson does seem to be like, focus on the here and now, focus on the people you care about. And it's ultimately sort of redemptive, because it's love will bring you through a lot of things, whether it's sibling love or, a relationship in the more traditional sense. I think that's the underlying, you come away with that just thinking that, wow, I really need to, pay attention to what's going on around me and focus on the people I care about.
That's very interesting because clearly, when you're writing, you obviously don't set out to give that message, right? In this genre of a book. I mean, it's, it's not a self-help, it's not a, personal improvement book, etc. But readers can take back some of that message at the core to say that, let's focus on now, let's focus on our real relationships, let's focus on what's good. I think that's a phenomenal message for readers.
Thank you.
So at this time, we can take in some questions coming on the Twitter feed. I'm going to, it's going to show up on your screen, and then you can just, respond to it live. Just give me a second here. So the first question coming up now on your screen, it's from Ronak, and it says, what's the darker side of Delhi? Is there a specific kind of darkness you're talking about?
That's a good question. That kind of sums up our entire first 20 minutes of conversation. Thank you, Ronak, for the question, though. Do you want to give this a shot? I'm going to say a few lines. I'm going to see what you got out of this. It's definitely at many levels. What we're talking about is sort of the urban violence. Any big city, Delhi has that kind of side, which we're only now coming to terms with or trying to deal with. But it's also a darkness, of an internal darkness, if you will, because, we're talking about certain mental health issues, we're talking about addiction, we're talking about loss, and we're talking about being lost. At some level, I think that's something a lot of people can identify with, especially in our bigger cities. It's very easy to feel isolated and like you're the only one who's going through this. And surprisingly, I don't know if you agree with me, Kumar, but the more connected we are, Twitter, Facebook, there's a huge positive to that. But sometimes, also because we're also showing our best sides, it's only our best photos, our holidays, it's never the actual drudgery. There's quite a, I think, impact on people who are, maybe more depressed or more unhappy with what's going on, because you think you're the only one who's having to deal with this.
Absolutely, I agree. And clearly, I'm one of those feeling that, because I'm seeing all these good photos and good holidays and like all the good stuff you mentioned, and I'm wondering, what did I do wrong?
What am I doing with my life? Yes.
So the next question is thankfully a broader one for you. Here it is on the screen.
Yeah.
It's from Ramana, and I'm not sure he or she, but she says, why there is a dearth of global stories in the Indian book market?
I'm not sure I'd agree with that. I mean, in terms of, do you think global stories as in Indians writing global stories?
I'm assuming that's the question.
I presume. Yeah, I mean, I think that we are now in this sort of maybe, I mean, in the last maybe 10 years, I mean, we've seen so many changes in the Indian fiction market. I think that you'll see more and more global stories. I think what people outside India want to see are those traditional Indian stories, not traditional, but Indian stories, and that's what has been ruling the market for the longest time. But there are more and more people now who are comfortable, and again, we're talking about Indian writing in English. It's a very small genre. I mean, I wouldn't speak to some of the regional languages where they're doing incredible work as well. But if you look at our cities and the kind of writers who are, that our cities are producing, I think that you'll find more and more cosmopolitan stories, to the extent that sometimes there is that kind of like, oh, you're not actually talking about the real India, which is, an ongoing debate. What is the real India? I think it's all of these and above.
Right. There are quite a few questions coming, which I think we've already answered. So there are questions about, tell us about the CBS knot and about the book, etc. So I'm just sifting through. Okay, here's one. So this is clearly one of your ardent readers, I guess, Sayan, and he says, Amrita, how do you make writing so effortless in its readability? Very few writers can and do.
So I think Sayan is very biased, because we've been chatting since the CNN IBN days, and he's very sweet and has always been very positive. So thank you for that comment, tweet, and it's good. It's a good boost, I have to say. But the thing is, when you're writing, and this book again, I was trying something new for my first book, and I'm writing in different voices. You have to make a huge effort. It obviously doesn't come, the first shot. I mean, everyone sort of thinks that first shot is going to be perfect, and this is the great story you've been wanting to tell. But whether it's language, you have to make sort of each character's tone different. Whether it's distinguishing between the different characters, it all has to be authentic, for the story to carry on. And then as a reader, you don't want to be stopping and thinking that's not really something that would that would hold up the story. So it's part of the process. I think it's not entirely effortless, but I'm so happy, and I hope it's true that it feels effortless to read.
Right. Speaking of characters, like a little while ago, you mentioned that from your journalism days, a lot of the experiences, a lot of the people you spoke to with regards to child sexual abuse or other related crime, you've been able to delve into a lot of that to write the book. Have you been able to also then look at some of these characters from the different facets, given your time as a journalist, and also, of course, living and breathing in Delhi?
Oh, from that perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for me, I think the way I write is also very incremental. It'll start with a conversation, a character, and then it builds from there. So it's taken a while. But what I think is quite funny is that they sort of take on a life of their own, and they're kind of real to me now, which sounds a little bit delusional, but they're I know exactly what each character will do, or if I try to write something, you can tell quite quickly that it's not authentic to that character. So whether it's Amy or Dan or these guys who are in this book, I think that after reading it, when the edits were happening, we kind of know what's going on with her. At the time, you don't really know that this one probably has a borderline personality disorder. You can, because it's quite clear. But I wouldn't analyze them so much, because again, I mean, you usually don't do that with your friends. By the time they're done, I'm like, okay, this is who they are, and very strong. I mean, they're very strong personalities. But I think what happens with a lot of writers, especially my first book, for example, with Broken News, because that was set in a newsroom, a lot of people who will come up to you and sort of be like, okay, who's that based on? And who is that? And isn't that just a combination of people? So you have to always sort of, wing it after a point when your books are out.
Right, right. Well, very interesting chatting with you, Amrita, and thank you so much for joining us on this session. Clearly, you're making good use of all your experiences as a journalist, and you've been covering books in India for a very, very long time as well. So, congratulations on your new book, and we hope to see it as a bestseller very soon. And just keep up all the good stuff.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all of your effort. And as you said, 100 authors in 10 days. Hats off to you. And thanks for this festival.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.